Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are, I don't care. What I do care about is that the daily news bulletin has just come by, fresh from the press. So let me just open it. The news of today are fuck all. Alright, I guess the news segment is over. Let's go on with the rest of the video. Today we talk about specs for raids. Tomorrow we will talk about specs for Mythic Plus. So when I say about specs for raids, I'm not talking about top raiding guilds specs, okay? I'm not talking about which specs are going to be stacked because of the 1.2% damage increase, okay? I'm talking about community perception. I'm talking about essentially all of you, most of you, something that will affect most of you. You have felt this on your skin, both in Mythic Plus and in raids, what happens when the community decides a spec is good, or the community decides a spec is bad. This is particularly problematic in Mythic Plus. You see, in raids, in normal and heroic, this doesn't happen that often, but you have been victims yourself of seeing even something like +7 Mythic Plus keys or +5 Mythic Plus keys, and people asking for a rogue, people asking for a Demon Hunter, or people asking for a Blood Knight tank in a +7, or people not inviting a Demonology Warlock in a +8. That is way more prevalent in Mythic Plus than it is in raids. This level of extreme community perception of certain specs. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Which of the specs are going to be popular and used and good in raids compared to the ones that might fall down a well and be forgotten until Blizzard puts a band-aid on them. Because this type of perception from you guys, from you players, a lot of the times comes from some YouTubers, content creators, Twitch streamers, who might say something like, Warlock is terrible in Mythic Plus, right? And because they said Warlock is terrible, a bunch of people watching them will start not inviting Warlock. And then people who join those groups will not see any Warlocks. So they will not invite any Warlocks themselves. And this thing is going to snowball. Until eventually, given enough time, a few weeks, most people will just naturally not want to invite Warlocks because they are bad. Why? I've never been in a group with one, I guess I don't need one. That's just about all the explanation you need. So it is a very dangerous situation. As you are reading, some of you are playing specs that will die, that will be forgotten. So it is good to prepare you for this situation, to get you ready. This is a safe space for your soon-to-be forgotten spec. So first we go through the raid composition. Tomorrow we will go through Mythic Plus. It's going to be, I guess, more fun because it can be more diverse than raids. It can be more flexible. But for raids, let's start with the DPS first. So when you look at DPS in your raid, you have to look at two things. Number one, the damage profile of the raid compared to the damage profile of your spec. And number two, are you a ranged DPS or are you on the bench? So, damage profile. If you remember, I made a legendary painting which has since then been sold for over $700,000 US. It was this one. This was the damage profile of Nathria. I also made one, I made a few more, for the previous BFA tiers, particularly the one from Nyalota. The main thing that came to attention, that should come to attention, is that Nyalota used to have a lot more red, or green, a lot more cleave, essentially, a lot more cleave and spread cleave. This allowed in Nyalota to have a lot of specs that did accidental AoE, passive AoE, to get a much better recognition from the community than their actual strengths. Look at something like a Demon Hunter, who had terrible single target. Demon Hunters were able to get by in Nyalota simply because everything they do in single target also does AoE, which made them go at the top of the meters because of the amount of adds in Nyalota. This was similar to things like Fire Mages, who just passively spread their Ignite everywhere. Another very powerful thing was the Destruction Warlocks with their Havoc. Now the first thing that should come to your attention in the DPS profiles of Nathria is that there is a lot of blue, a lot of single target. I'm even gonna give you the upgraded painting with the execute phases, the important execute phases on the encounters. So single target is gonna be very popular and very needed in the new raid. So we have to go back and look at the specs and the damage profiles, which are the specs with the higher single target damage. Just a few days ago, I showed you the current sims for single target damage on Nathria. The current sims on single target damage, which is this one. with the slight updates, as I mentioned. Elemental Shaman now using the correct legendary, but more or less it's the same. So obviously when you look at this, it's pretty easy to think about which specs could become popular in Nathria. Of course you have to start looking at buffs as well. Regardless of how badly Havoc Demon Hunter is doing, and we're looking at it, it's doing pretty badly, your raid is still going to need Chaos Brand, right? You do need the magical damage debuff. And because Vengeance won't be a very popular tank for raids, Havoc essentially gets a free spot. So we have to start with Havoc. Then we have to continue. Another pretty safe spot can be Warrior. Once again, Battle Shout. Not only do you want Battle Shout, but you also want Rallying Cry as a healer external, as a raid cooldown. So a Warrior also gets a spot, because similar to Havoc, Protection Warrior is not doing too well right now. That's an Arms Warrior in your raid composition. Or it can be Fury as well. But right now Arms is just a little bit better in single target, especially because of the execute they can go for, which is slightly better than Fury's. Then you have to look at other buffs and debuffs. You have Brewmaster Monk, which is going to give you your Monk debuff, your Mystic Touch. Of course you can go for Windwalker and Mistweaver as well, but Brewmaster is just the safest one, because it's one of the better tanks for progression. And your other tank can be whatever. It can be a Paladin, it can be a Death Knight. I do think Paladin right now is the better one, the better choice to go together with Brewmaster. That's gonna be a pretty popular combo, Paladin and Monk. As far as the melees, after your Arms Warrior and your Havoc Demon Hunter, you should also probably go for an Unholy DK. Not only Unholy DK right now are slightly overtuned, Unholy DKs also have Anti-Magic Zone. And this is not a case of a single buff. This is not a case of saying, oh well, Warrior is not doing too well, just bring one for Shout. Havoc isn't doing too well, we just get one for the debuff. For Death Knights, having more than one is not going to hurt you because of Anti-Magic Zone. The more you have, the better. The vast majority of raid-wide huge AoE damage coming in is going to be about magic damage, so Anti-Magic Zone is going to be insane on that. So this should be the start of the composition. Your 2 tanks and then the 3 DPS that can bring something special in melee. The Warrior, the Demon Hunter and the Death Knight. Now, a cautious mind right now would stop. That's enough melee DPS. 3 is enough. We don't need any more. If you want to fill a few more melee DPS slots, Subtlety Rogue is doing very well. You have Retribution Paladin, which is also doing fine. Actually, even Windwalker Monk is not doing too badly. My pick, though, would be for Announcement Shaman. Not only because they are simming very well for single target right now, although their problem remains that their burst single target is pretty poor. We have to talk about Wind Fury Totem. Wind Fury Totem is a decent damage increase. It is going to average probably 3% damage increase for your party, depending on which melee DPS are in your party. Remember that for something like an Arms Warrior, a Wind Fury Totem is almost an 8% damage increase. That's really big, by the way. But yeah, of course it's not as powerful as a Battle Shout or a Mystic Touch or a Chaos Brand, but it's still pretty good. So an Announcement Shaman would also be a pretty nice pick for your melee DPS group, but that's as far as I will go. For melee DPS, I think 6 is going to be your maximum. I think more than 6 it starts to become a little bit crowded. So then we have to move over range DPS. So we have to start with another picks as a given. The number 1 given is going to be a Mage, and the number 2 given is going to be a Warlock. Warlock because of your Hellstones, Warlock because of your Portals, as well as Mage because of your Arcane Brilliance. So that's 2 easy picks. I would also go for a second Mage, mostly because of how close and competitive mages are with different damage profiles. You can get a Fire Mage and an Arcane Mage, or a Fire Mage and a Frost Mage, or just both, playing the same spec depending on the encounter. That's the power of playing a pure DPS class. You can choose your spec based on the damage profile of the fight. As for the other 5 spots, it's mostly just up to you and up to the performance of the specs right now. Nothing is really necessary when bringing these specs. They're not bringing anything that's required. I went with a Shadow Priest, a Marksmanship Hunter, an Elemental Shaman, and Double Balanced Druid. Double Balanced Druid because of the current state of their spec, the current state of their DPS being very high. It might as well be replaced by Double Shadow Priest as well, for the same reasons. And then Marksmanship Hunter, because having a Hunter in a raid is always very useful. It's not one of those mandatory things, but the very high mobility with the immunity is always very helpful. And then a Shaman because It's doing pretty good damage for the damage profile you want, which is single target, as well as some funnel. Plus, I play one, so I have to put myself in. I'm the coach. So these are the picks I think are going to be pretty popular. The ones that have been left out more often than not are going to be specs from the same pure DPS classes that are simply doing less damage right now. For example, Beast Mastery with Marksmanship, Destruction and Demonology compared to Affliction, or Outlaw and Assassination compared to Subtlety. That is also, when I mention the strength of a pure DPS class, that's also the weakness. If you particularly like one of the specs, if it performs badly, you kind of have to either suck it up and change spec, or be destined to play a spec that's less effective. But when you look at healers instead, so a few days ago, actually over a week ago, I made a video about some predictions for the expansions that was about healers and the damage profile of Nathria. Not the damage profile of the DPS, rather the damage taken profile. So what you have to heal in the raids. If you are new to the game, or new to the raids, the raiding scene, you have to know that for the last at least 6 years, maybe more, the gold standard of healing has been trying to reduce healers as much as possible to leave space for more and more DPS, because DPS checks, essentially cock blocks, that you couldn't go past unless you had a certain amount of DPS, arose in the encounters more and more. So the solution of the best guilds was to cut one healer. We cut one healer for a DPS so we can reach the gap, and then we can cut another healer, and then another healer. We went from having even 6 healers in a raider group to having 3 and being completely standard. When this happens, the only reason why this could happen is because you add certain specs that can allow you to not take damage rather than healing it after. These specs obviously are Restoration Shaman, Discipline Priest and Holy Paladin, because Spirit Link Totem, Power Word Barrier and Aura Mastery with Devotion Aura give you damage reduction. And when you keep cutting your healers, meaning you have less and less healing done available to you, the most important thing is to just stay alive. You know, people have realized when you look at a damage taken profile like this, that all you have to do is survive those big spikes from the boss. Once you have survived those big spikes from the boss, you don't need 6 healers anymore to keep you alive. All you needed was 3 that had damage reduction to allow you to live, and once you have lived that part, they can take their time to heal you back up. You can use your own self-sustain, your own self-heal, your leech, you can use your own healthstone, your own potion. And with this strategy in mind, as I said, the gold standard became just invite classes that have damage reduction. Spread the damage reductions throughout all the encounter where the big damage phase is coming, pair it together with something like Rallying Cry, something like Darkness, add to the rotation of healing CDs, things like your own personal CDs, as well as your own potions and your own healthstones, and you can get by most of the fights with just 3 healers, sometimes 4 if it's really heavy. So this entire long preamble was to say that the prediction was that this would have become less important in Nathria in exchange for pure throughput, pure HPS, so pure healing done, not just damage reduction anymore. Some specs that have historically had very high throughput but have been left behind purely because they didn't have damage reduction were Holy Priest, Mistweaver Monk and Restoration Druid. They have a very easy time healing multiple targets, even spread targets with HOTS and with smart heals, targeting them automatically, which made them very powerful at consistent healing. Something like a Holy Paladin, for example, is way more centered around burst healing. Something like Discipline Priest, for example, is also way more centered around the burst healing of their Schism window and their barrier. So they are much better at healing a single huge chunk of damage taken, and then relax when there is much less damage and their big abilities are cooling down. And then the big damage comes back, their cooldowns are back, and they can repeat. But what happens? What happens if instead of having a 4 out of 10 long phase of damage taken, and then 3 spikes of 10 out of 10 spread throughout the encounter, instead of having this, you have a continuous phase of 7 out of 10 damage taken. Suddenly, all your very strong damage reduction cooldown are much less powerful, and suddenly all your consistent healing becomes much more powerful. So this was my prediction. And to show you that I am a man of morals, a man of my word, my picks for healers for the raid composition are going to be Resto Shaman, Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest, and Restoration Druid. So yes, I went back on my word. I betrayed everything I stood for, mostly because this is still the safe play. It is still the way people have been healing and the way people have been dealing with the damage taken for over 6 years. So it's going to be essentially your comfort zone. We know what's going on with this composition, we already know what to do. It's going to be the simplest way to execute. You get your 3 damage reduction specs, and then you get your strongest, versatile, all-purpose throughput healer, which is Resto Druid. But I still don't walk back on my point. I still think specs like, particularly specs like Mistweaver Monk, will become more powerful, more meta, and more accepted because of their throughput becoming much more important in Castle Nathria compared to, for example, Nyalota. Now, for a little mention about tanks, since I picked Brewmaster and Protection Paladin quickly. The absolutely most important thing when you raid as a tank is to stay alive. We are talking progression, we are talking, we are here to kill the boss. As a tank, I'm sorry, this isn't Mythic Plus. We don't need Twilight Devastation. We don't need your DPS Legendary or your DPS Azerite traits. We need you to stay alive. That's literally the only thing that matters. Because the more you stay alive, the more you can continue progressing. The more you can let the DPS keep failing mechanics so they can learn them. If you keep getting one shot as a tank, then that's not going to work. So my best picks for tanks are going to be Brewmaster Monk, Protection Paladin, and Blood Death Knight. They are simply the 3 best specs that have the easiest time staying alive. Also particularly the 3 best specs at being self-sufficient, at not needing help from outside sources. The strongest cooldowns, the strongest, or rather, not even strongest, the more varied cooldowns for all the different types of damage taken. But to me, that would be the gold standard when it comes to raiding. If it was for me, personally, I would take even double Brewmaster Monk, purely because of how simple it is to keep it alive. But as I already mentioned, Blood Death Knight can also have the huge utility of an anti-magic zone, and Protection Paladin has the usual amount of utility from everything, literally, as well as some cheese with the bubble, and the double bubble with Blessing of Protection. They technically have an external for their buddy tank themselves with Blessing of Sacrifice, so they can also be a very good choice. The ones left out, Protection Warrior, Guardian Druid, and Vengeance Demon Hunter. Vengeance Demon Hunter is incredibly strong in Mythic Plus, at least right now at lower keys, or not right now, soon to be at lower keys. Protection Warrior at the bottom, still is. Guardian Druid is my personal shield spec. I do think Guardian Druid is going to be one of the specs that is going to become better because of what I mentioned, the ability to stay alive. Guardian Druid, with some of the changes to their talents, some of the changes to their Pulverize, and something I mentioned 50 times already, their Bark Skin synergy with their new Legendary is going to make them ridiculously strong in defensives for raids. Now, on a side note, very short side note because this will be in tomorrow's video, the Bark Skin Legendary is still going to be about raids. For now, in Mythic Plus, you just want damage as a Guardian Druid. You are giga tanky already at lower keys, so you just want to fill your rotation with more damage, not more tankiness. When you go up at higher keys in a few weeks, you will have plenty of Soul Ash to craft your Barkskin Legendary if you're planning on doing Mythic Plus and not raiding. So the tankiness, the super extra tankiness of the Guardian Druid is only relevant here for tanking in raids. So this is my mock-up raid composition for Castle Nathria. The one main change I would make is replacing the Holy Paladin for a Mistweaver Monk, as well as replacing the Protection Paladin for my Shield Guardian Druid. But we're talking about community perception here, we're talking about popularity, so I find it hard to believe Guardian Druid is going to become very popular compared to something like a Prot Paladin or even a Blood DK. That's why I haven't put it in my mainstay top 20 raid composition group. The rest is more subject to personal preference, replacing, for example, a Retribution Paladin for a Windwalker Monk, replacing 2 of the Balanced Druids for an extra Shadow Priest, even 1 more Marksmanship for 1 Elemental, or 1 more Elemental for 1 Marksmanship. But in general, this is the layout of specs, the layout of classes I see being popular in raid encounters for Castle Nathria. Unfortunately, for the people I see with my third eye already complaining, I'm not the one who decides, guys. I don't have a magic wand, I don't get to change community perception and start inviting Survival Hunter, Feral Druid, or Demonology Warlock, you know. That is just how you choose to invite people and how it's going to be reflected in the popularity of specs in raids. So this was it for the raiding part. Tomorrow we are going over the Mythic Plus part. Now the Mythic Plus part is going to be way more varied. It's going to be more varied because some of the synergies and some of the combinations can change. For example, there are certain healers that have an easier time healing certain tanks that can work better with certain healers. And then you can have melee compositions with your Mystic Touch buff, range compositions with your Chaos Brand from one Demon Hunter tank, and a few other synergies. So that is going to be a little bit different. Tell me, what are your thoughts about raid specs? Specs purely for raids. So mostly, I'm talking single target, I'm talking single target funnel, and some 2-target cleave, you know, priority single target damage burst. Which of the specs could become popular? Not necessarily OP, not flavor of the month, just community-wise the specs that are going to become the go-to in raid encounters. So, see you guys tomorrow with the Mythic Plus video. I am fleeing the scene, and in the meantime I have to go and make some food.